into the series that I'm giving these 3 weeks on Septuagessima, this small season leading up to Lent so we can better prepare. I'm using for these 3 Sundays the great commandments of loving God, loving neighbor, and as we love ourselves. And I spoke last week about the love of God and how we should make Lenten resolutions to improve our relationship with God. And this week we're going to speak about love of neighbor, and with the intention of considering things that we might want to do during Lent to improve that relationship. Again, the love of neighbor flows from our love for God, because love is one. Love is of God, and therefore it's not divided or partial or anything like that. So the scripture that best says this, of course, is in Matthew 25. You're familiar with the story. It's called the Judgment of the Nations, where the sheep and goat are separated based on whether they've done things like fed the hungry, visited the sick and imprisoned, etc. And both groups, the damned and the blessed, both ask God how it was that they did these things to him. He says, and you're familiar again with this, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it for one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Love of neighbor flows from our love of God. The two are united. So I just want to comment on a couple of things regarding our love of neighbor. Like last week, I want to touch on the use of the internet and electronic devices briefly. Because again, it's one of the greatest factors. I won't call it an evil, although it is very often used for evil. But it's one of the greatest factors in people's moral lives, in their spiritual lives, and everything due to their permeating everything. So one of the things that we want to do is keep in mind that the overuse of these devices, or the careless use of these devices and social media, makes it easier to be uncharitable. When you are not face to face with the person, it is much easier to say things that you normally would not say to the person, or say things in a way that you would not say them. It's also very difficult to do damage control once you've said something on the internet, because most of it is always visible to other people, and all of it is always visible in some way to someone. These devices can also be a great obstacle to familial relationships, either between spouses, between parents and their children, children with their parents, or even among children. These electronics are used way too often as pacifiers, which I'm sure do great damage to the small ones, particularly in their mental development, but I don't have necessarily any studies to point that out off the top of my head, but I know they exist. So we want to be very careful of that, and also not avoid our relationships by hiding in our phones. Whenever you say, send, post, or do anything online, remember the words of St. Paul. No base talk must cross your lips, only what will serve to build up the faith and bring a grace to those who are listening. When you're at home and with your family, do not be absorbed in your phone. I mean, I know teenagers are always going to find a way to hide, and that's inevitable, but we do not want to use our phones to hide from our families. In the event that we need to separate ourselves more from our phones, which is a lot of people, we need to work on filling that void, developing good personal relationships, especially in our family, with our friends, some healthy hobbies, and learn to pray better to fill that vacuum which we are trying to fill with whatever is on that screen. When you're with other people, do not check your phone constantly. The chances are it is not a life or death message that you are getting. It's hard to overcome that one for those who are in it. And I also personally know that I've been in groups, either as an observer or myself in the group, where it's actually possible to maintain a cognizance of what's going on around you and continue engaging with the people while at the same time looking at messages and all that. Maybe that's my ADHD, I don't know, but I know I've seen it. So it's not an absolute evil, but I would say you want to err on the side of caution on that one, and to wean yourself and to not always have that out. Another area, and a related area I want to comment on briefly when it comes to love of neighbor, is the virtue of chastity. The custody of the eyes and of the heart. Chastity is living sexuality as God intended it in thought, word, and in deed. And even if it's not lust, we have to be very careful with what we call objectification. We know that it's the first wow is not lust, especially if you're not choosing that. The initial reaction is not because it's a reaction, is not a sin. The second wow is where you start getting into trouble. Okay? But even beyond that, to simply use people, whether on a screen or in person, for your own satisfaction, sexual or not, is objectifying. If your base attitude towards other people is, what can they do for me? Then that is self-love. That is not loving your neighbor. So, as we're considering love of neighbor, again, digitally or in person, whatever the case may be, is to reorient ourselves in our thinking to a love of neighbor which is not based in what advantage we get out of the interaction and the relationship. And the last area I want to speak about in our relationship with others has to do with one of the principal practices associated with Lent: prayer, fasting, almsgiving, and physical mortification. And the one that is directed towards our neighbor, to take us off of ourselves, away from ourselves, out of ourselves, is that of almsgiving. Now, to be clear right off the bat, almsgiving is not tithing. Tithing is what we owe God as our first fruits in gratitude for the fact that we can have an income, and to support the church, which provides so much for us. Even if we don't personally feel that we're getting as much out, we still owe because of what is provided. The almsgiving is specifically directed to giving to those who are in need. And of course, there's an interplay between the two, of course, especially when very often donations are taken through the church. For example, our second collection is often that we take for the St. Teresa Apostle. So there is a little bit of an overlap there, but there is a distinction between the first fruits we offer to God as a duty and out of love, but then what we then extend to our neighbor. It's of course not limited to money. It could be material goods and other things, and I want to talk about the three ways that we can practice this almsgiving. We want to start, of course, with the idea of remembering that everything that we have comes from God. It's this fact that we understand that intellectually. We can all say that we agree, yes, everything comes from God, thanks be to God, great, right? It's assimilating that into our heart and minds and the way we choose and think that can be difficult. But it's always essential to remember that if you have a family to provide for, that if you have health and skills that are needed to do the work to provide, and if you are even alive, that is a gift from God. Just because we use what God has given us to earn the money does not make it ours. That's why, again, the idea of first fruits is very important. So when it comes to almsgiving, we certainly give money. We give money particularly to those who needed to provide food, warmth, shelter, and clothing, etc., etc. I will confess that it is more difficult in modern days when financial systems aren't as complicated as they are, as bill paying and things are. This is not the same thing as someone's starving and you give them money and then they go buy the meal, right? There's a lot of complicated things to it, and I get that. But the fact is that there are people who have needs, and we can help with that. Almsgiving, particularly during Lent, is supposed to go beyond normal giving, the normal charity that you simply give because we love our neighbor. Like fasting, it should hurt a little bit. One of the good suggestions that I've heard in the past is, particularly if you engage in recreational activities regularly that cost something. A very simple example, of course, what I'm talking about is going to the movies, but it could be any number of things, right? Is to sacrifice that activity, and then instead of using that money to go buy something else, is give that money as alms, either to the church for further distribution, like in the St. Teresa Apostolate, or directly to the person. We want to avoid the attitude that, oh, I think they're just going to misuse it. That is possible, and there is a certain prudence to that. I remember one time when I was a seminarian, this gentleman came into the office, asked for help, and the office manager immediately told him no, and he left. And before I could register what was happening, he commented on certain things about the way the gentleman was dressed and all that. He very clearly did not need the money. So, but in all of that, while I don't want to deny prudence, I also want you to remember that we should always err on the side of mercy, because unless there's a clear sign that it's going to be misused, our obligation is to give. Their obligation is to use it properly. And there's a difference there. St. Basil the Great puts it this way: the bread which you hold back belongs to the hungry, the coat which you guard in your locked store chest belongs to the naked, the footwear moldering in your closet belongs to those without shoes, the silver that you keep hidden in a safe place belongs to one in need. Thus, however many are those whom you could have provided for, so many are those whom you wrong. And this, of course, applies not only to shoes, but to toys, to tools, to cars, to gadgets, to computers, you name it, whatever it is that we hoard. Do we really need all the things we have? That's a rhetorical question. The answer is no, we don't. We do not need all the things that we've got. But in a slightly different area, there is our time, which we can also share. This is a little bit different because we don't earn time. Time is given to us, and time is a measure of change, is what it is. Our time is given to us, and therefore it is not ours, but it is God. Phrases like wasting my time do not make sense because it's not mine to begin with. Perhaps we don't have a lot of money. Obviously, the amount is not what's important. It's the love and how much our generosity. But we certainly can give time. Many people can do that. We call for volunteers. I know a trip to Alabama for a week might be a little bit more time than some people are willing to give. But the volunteers, for example, that we've asked for the homeschool, among other things, those things certainly can be given. We can work at the local food pantry. We've got a number of women that help in the St. Teresa Apostle. And I emphasize the fact that they're women because the men don't volunteer, at least not currently, which is sad, and that needs to change. It's also sad that the same, 5 or so women that work in the St. Teresa Apostle are also the ones who are helping with the school, and we need more people to give of that time. For those who might be able to, they can do manual labor for a neighbor, and just simply spending more time with our spouses or our children, or we can take extra time to speak with a brother or sister, a classmate, someone that we know who might be lonely, many parishioners who are homebound and could use our charity of our time as well. And then don't forget your talents. Regardless of the amount of money or time that you have, all of us have talents. Now, we may not have time to share them as much as we'd like, but our talents is another way that we can give alms to others. Whatever it is, construction, landscaping, sewing, intellectual gifts, whatever it is that we've got, we can share those with those in need. Obviously, it starts at home, but the home, the family, the parish, and the greater community should also benefit from those because God has given them to us for His greater glory and our salvation.